And I just recorded this. In fact, I want to remind you to pause the video after the day. Okay. So we're not going to be I don't know. Okay. But I think it's all set up, and I'll be back with you next one. Great. Thank you. No problem. Good morning. Is the Tulane group here? Good morning. Good morning. Good.
Would it be a TB testing this year?
I think so. Yeah.
Would you pay for those? Just out of pocket. Is your insurance covered?
Mm-hmm. Have you been to Signal Center?
Hmm.
Don't cover. Yeah.
The CPS, I think, is who my wife's.
That's weird.
But they don't cover TB screening. I mean, it's not that expensive, but still,
So annoying.
it's like that's a pretty important thing to cover.
Okay, so I guess we'll wait a few more minutes. It looks like we've got the Tulane group online, as well as a few other people who have called into the GoToMeeting. So we'll I'll try and take questions. If I don't notice when somebody's trying to get my attention on the webinar, please give me a heads up if I'm not looking at the screen. That'll help things go smoothly.
Yeah, one at the day, like everybody has to be on. Yeah.
Okay, might as well get started. Probably a few more people will trickle in. So my name is Emily Levitin. Sorry. And I'm an associate professor in the Department of Epidemiology and also currently the department chair. And I'm a member of the CCTS Biostatistics Epidemiology Research Design, known as the BIRD core. So our mission here is to help people with their study design analysis issues. So you're welcome to contact me at any time about any issues you might have. Today I'm going to be talking about Study Design 101. I have to say this is a hard topic for me to talk about because this is the thing I'm really passionate about. So trying to give you a good overview in an hour is challenging because this is the thing I'm really passionate about. But hopefully you'll get at least enough of a taste so that you can go and seek out other resources as you need them. As we go, please ask me any questions. Make sure should be interactive, and just like wave me down or just shout out a question if you have any. Okay. So just what we're going to talk about. First, just go over some of the basic epidemiologic study designs. There are other sort of more specialized designs, but most of them are sort of derivations of these basic types of designs. Talk a little bit about correlation and causation, and then developing a testable hypothesis. And then we'll talk a little bit about sort of the process of going through how would you start designing a study, and finally some resources if you need them. So as an epidemiologist, I will be sort of presenting from the epidemiology point of view. But for all types of observational research, have somewhat similar designs, and sometimes the words are a little bit different, but generally we're talking about the same things. So the first type of study design, and these are sort of ordered. This is the conventional order in which these are presented, and they're sort of ordered in a way in terms of the strength of the evidence that you have for causation, assuming that the study is done well. So the first is called an ecological study. And really what we're looking at is correlations between rates of disease and rates or degree of exposure, right? And both of these are sort of population measures, right? So we're not measuring an individual person's exposure or rate, or whether or not an individual person has a particular disease. What we're looking at is groups, right? So countries, regions, counties, something like that. So one of the famous studies is called the 7-country study. This is one of the first sort of contemporary studies looking at diet and coronary heart disease. So what they did was they identified a number of different regions, right? So it's called 7 countries, but more regions. And they looked at the percentage of calories from saturated fat, and they graphed that on the y-axis from the CHD deaths per 100. So what you can see is that there's a relationship here, right? There's a correlation. The correlation coefficient is about 0.8, right? Maximum correlation coefficient is 1. So this is a pretty strong correlation. What you can see is that G here is Corfu, right? So Mediterranean sort of area. E is Eastern Finland, right? All the way on the end. And we're, more than, or about 25% calories from saturated fat. So it turns out this region was a logging region in Finland, and the sort of standard meal that people would take with them was a sandwich of butter and cheese, right? So very high saturated fat content. And this isn't the only evidence about saturated fat and coronary heart disease, but this really triggered a lot of studies going forward. I have to say, I learned recently, I was talking to a friend's dad that there's this whole conspiracy theory about this. So when I was trying to find a graph of this, there pops up all of these conspiracy theories about the American Heart Association being against butter for unspecified reasons. And so, this is not very strong evidence, right? Because the percent calories from saturated fat, that's coming from agricultural data, right? So agriculture agencies will track how much food is produced, and then sort of estimate how much is exported, how much is consumed, how much is imported, and calculate the percent that way, right? So that's not taking into account within population variation. It's not taking into account food wastage and other things. And the deaths are coming from vital statistics, right? So death certificate data. Some of you have probably filled out death certificates. And if you have, sometimes you're really kind of guessing, right? If you don't have a whole lot of information about the person. When was the study done? It was done in the early 60s. Right, so a lot of these, the populations have shifted quite a bit since then, right? So, core food now has a higher percent saturated fat because, there's sort of more or changes in the traditional diet patterns. Eastern Finland has a much lower percentage. So, things have moved around somewhat. Other questions? Right. The other issue here, right, is that probably the way people eat is correlated with a lot of other things. So one of my professors in grad school did use the same CH2 death rates and plotted it against bathtubs per capita, right, as sort of a measure of development. And you actually see, the points aren't exactly where they are, but you see a pretty strong correlation with that as well, right? So these sorts of studies are good for hypothesis generating, but they're really not taking into account a lot of the variability that we see. Right? The strength, though, is that a lot of times you can do this with existing data, right? So if you are trying to figure out, you're just trying to generate hypotheses, you're trying to figure out what's going on with populations or between populations, a lot of times this is administrative data that's collected for other reasons, right? So agricultural agencies are collecting this to try and figure out what sorts of food their constituents are producing and consuming, and vital statistics are collected for other sorts of purposes. But we have what's called the ecological fallacy, right? So we don't know that the people with the very high saturated fat content in Eastern Finland are actually the ones dying of CHD. And so that's one of the sort of problems with this kind of study, as well as the inability to control for a lot of confounding factors. So then when you move on to a cross-sectional study, right, so now instead of looking at populations, now we're looking at individuals, right? So we're measuring exposure and outcome in individuals, and we're measuring them at the same time. Right, so that's why it's called cross-sectional, because you have this sort of snapshot of what's going on. So you're looking at prevalent disease and prevalent exposure. So what's there in the population at a particular point. So this is a study that I did. So we're looking at unrecognized MIs, and about 1 in 5 MIs are not clinically recognized. And this can happen for a bunch of different reasons. And we were looking at associations, right? So what we have is we have a population of about 30,000 people. We have electrocardiograms on all these people. Right? So we're able to detect Q waves, which are indicative of prior MI. And we also have questions that we've asked them about whether or not they've ever had a heart attack. Right? So the people who say, no, I've never had a heart attack, but have Q waves are the people who we're considering to have an unrecognized MI. We're also, at the same point in time, when we did the ECGs, we have information about their age, their smoking status, whether or not they have self-reported diabetes, self-reported hypertension, and then also a measurement of their systolic blood pressure. And what you can see is that there are associations with unrecognized MI, and they're pretty much in the directions that we expected. Right? So some of them are risk factors for MI in general, and actually all of these are risk factors for MI in general. So we see pretty much what we would expect. However, this is not the best study design for this, right? Because we don't know, a lot of things about how people wound up with this unrecognized MI. However, it was relatively simple to do logistically, right? It was quick because we don't have to wait for anything to happen, right? We have the measurement and we have the exposure and outcome at the same time. However, there are problems, right? So we have prevalence related to both the incidence and the duration of the disease, which means that the people who made it to be in our study, they have to have, had the MI, survived the MI, and then, entered our study, right? So we have, we don't know that these risk factors, that the associations we saw are actually the associations with incident incidence of these unrecognized MIs. We just know that this is sort of who wound up in our study. The other thing is that the disease may change the exposure. In this case, it's probably not that likely, but one of my friends is an epidemiologist who studies lupus, right? And you keep seeing all of these studies that say, okay, vitamin D is lower in people with lupus. So therefore, if we give people vitamin D, they'll be less likely to develop lupus. The problem with that is people with lupus are sun sensitive, right? Vitamin D largely comes from sun exposure. So that's a case where the outcome, your outcome of interest, your disease, is going to cause a change in that exposure. Right, so that study design is not very good. So my friend is always trying to get those studies, trying to write editorials and stuff about those studies, because there is that sort of major problem with drawing the conclusion that vitamin D is causing lupus. Low vitamin D is causing lupus. In my study, thinking about how we got to having an unrecognized MI. And this is the regard study population, which is a big cohort study based here at UAB. Right, so the person had to have an MI that caused Q waves, right? Not all MIs do. So we have risk factors for that. The MI had to not be recognized at the time, either by the people treating, or the medical team, or by the participant themselves, right? So it's possible that the medical team actually knew that the person had an MI, but they either didn't understand or denied it. They had to survive. That Q wave had to persist, right? So Q waves also resolve. So all of these things may have different risk factors, and all we're seeing is sort of the mush of these risk factors associated with unrecognized MI. We don't see the full pathway. Questions? Comments?
I mean, how do you use that kind of data? You use that data just to tell people to argue for more grant funding for more studies? I mean, just...
yeah, right. So that's one way you can use that data, right? So similar to the Ecological study, you can sort of use it as a preliminary step. In some cases, if you can argue that the exposure and outcome are not, or that the outcome isn't going to change your exposure, and that it's unlikely to be related to essentially the survival or the duration of the disease, you can use it to try and draw causal conclusions, right? So we've got another study we're looking at in regards, we're looking at variants in the PCSK9 gene and LDL cholesterol, right? So if LDL cholesterol is our outcome, that's clearly not going to change the genetic makeup of the population. We have a relatively young population, so we think that we don't have too much problem in terms of the people not surviving in order long enough to enter our study. So from that, those sorts of studies, we can draw stronger conclusions. So it really depends on what the study question is and what we can do with this. For this study, so this was part of the first step. What we were actually trying to do was we were trying to figure out whether there was a way to develop a screening algorithm. So can we take these characteristics and screen some certain people with electrocardiograms and not screen everybody, because electrocardiograms are not indicated for people without symptoms at this point. So this was essentially saying, is there some sort of algorithm that we could do that we could just institute some sort of screening program? It didn't really work, and largely I think it's because we have this sort of complicated pathway. And so it was very hard to say, okay, this group, there were risk factors, but it's hard to say this group was really substantially more likely than that group to have an unrecognized MI.
I have a question about this particular study. So for example, people with heartburn or not with it, but that's often like a symptom that they'll say, like they'll confuse it for an MI. Heartburn can be confused for. So how do you, I guess, factor in those things? Like, is there a way for you to check and see, like, oh, does this patient have a diagnosis of, or I guess and eliminate, or think that they can improve like that?
Right. So in this study, we couldn't. So one of the concerns, right, is that people will. There's sort of two ways that can be a problem, right? One is that the person thinks they're having a heart attack, but they've actually got heartburn or GERD, and the other is that someone who has a history of that may sort of discount any chest pain, right? We didn't have that information in the study, but that would be something that it would be a stronger study if we did. Other questions? And then the final major study design that we talk about as epidemiologists are cohort studies. So with a cohort study, or actually we have case control studies as well, sorry. We identify a population at risk of the disease of interest, and we follow up to see whether exposed groups are more likely to develop disease or develop disease more quickly. So this is a lesson in why you should, if you rearrange your slides, you should go through them again before. What we're doing is we're saying, okay, we're going to identify a population that's at risk of developing our outcome of interest. And then we're going to, determine who's exposed and who's not, and then over time, right? So now you have this time component where you have people who don't have your disease when you start, and then see who develops disease over time. And we want to know whether exposed groups are more likely to develop the disease or to develop the disease more quickly. So for an example, this is data from the Health Professionals Follow-Up Study, which is a large-scale cohort study of men. And so there are 38,000 men who completed questionnaires about drinking habits in 1986. And then every 2 years thereafter, participants were sent questionnaires to say, have you had a heart attack? And if yes, or if the questionnaire is not returned, the researchers search for death certificates for the participants. So this study is done almost entirely through the mail. Makes it fairly cheap, right, to do. It limits what you can do. The reason they selected health professionals for this study is because they thought that people would actually be able to report more accurately. When people without medical training go in, like a lot of stuff, they get a lot of information and they might not be able to return it, to report on it accurately. So they were thinking that if we go for people who have medical training, they're going to be able to tell us tell us about their health history. And what they're looking at is rates of heart disease among those with various levels and types of alcohol consumption. So here's the main results. Right? So looking at this sort of graph, we've got the alcohol consumption per day. We have categories of 0 grams, 0.1 to 9.9 grams per day, so this is less than 1 drink a day. This is about a drink a day for 10 to 14.9, 15 to 49.9, right? So that's, you're looking at, more than 1 to like 3-ish, and then more than that, so more than 50 grams per day. This axis is the relative risk, right? So we see a lot of relative risk estimates. So this is essentially the risk. So if we look at this point here, right, the upside down triangles are beer consumption. So this is less than 1 drink a day for beer compared to 0 drinks a day for beer. And the relative risk here, the lowest it can be would be 0, and it can go up to infinity. And then these sort of whiskers here are the confidence intervals, 95% confidence intervals. Questions about how to look at these sorts of graphs? So what do you think? What is this telling you?
If you don't want to have a heart attack, you drink as much as you possibly can.
So if you don't want to have a heart attack, right, so drinking is inversely associated with heart attack. Is it as much as you possibly can? much data do we have on, do you think we have on really heavy drinking?
I mean, it's probably a small subset of that population.
Right, so it's a small subset of that population, right? So we're talking about, most of our data here is like in this area, right? So we're talking about moderate drinking here. We're talking about moderate drinking for 2 reasons, right? Or 2 that I can think of. So any ideas about why this study doesn't really tell you about the as much as you possibly can aspect?
Population screen is probably not going to have as high an incidence rate of at least reporting severe alcohol abuse.
Right. So we're looking at health professionals. These are people who are actively working at the time when they were enrolled, right? So they probably have a lower rate of really problematic alcohol use than the general population. And, we're relying on self-report here, right? So people who have very, very high alcohol intake are likely not to tell us, right? So self-reported alcohol intake, if you ask people, they'll tell you the same answer over and over, right? So there's not a whole lot of variability in terms of, if you ask somebody how much they drink, they'll answer you and give you the answer. But we have a hard time really distinguishing about whether people are essentially lying consistently or reporting accurately consistently. So in other studies where they have higher levels of alcohol intake, it actually looks like it starts going up at the end. So people, very high levels of alcohol intake are probably cardiotoxic. Any other thoughts about this graph?
Other thoughts about the red line kind of spike there that seems inconsistent?
Right. So we have kind of this funny bump here. We can also see that that confidence bound is really broad. So what's going on there? Probably a little bit of statistical noise. So you'll sometimes hear in the sort of lay media that red wine, you should drink red wine for your heart. Does this look like it really supports that? Yeah, so probably not, right? It's probably, this would suggest that any sort of ethanol intake is going to be cardioprotective.
But this graph still tells us that, the more you drink, the better. Even if intermediately, like even if it's in the, it's kind of sloping down, right?
Yeah. Well, at least for this, in this range, right? In the range that we're able to look
like drinking 1 and drinking 2 is better than 1.
For MI, right?
Yeah.
So this is actually, there have been a number of studies looking at this, and this is pretty consistent. When you start looking at the higher levels, you start seeing an uptick. And if you look at, sort of a composite of all the bad things that can happen to a person, right? Sort of shifts where that nadir is. So, this is somewhat suggestive of a decrease. One of the things that we worry about, particularly with alcohol research, is that in the U.S., moderate alcohol intake is associated with a higher socioeconomic status and more exercise and more, actually, at least in the regards study, more intake of fruits and vegetables. Right. So we have some concerns about socioeconomic status. This is something, right? So one of the options is to do a randomized trial. It's hard to get a randomized trial of alcohol intake. Right? It's hard to do. There is actually one going on. So what they did was they took people who were non-drinkers with diabetes, right, who were in their 50s and 60s, and randomized them to either alcohol or no alcohol. They're following that up long term. So the idea there was that they would, that they were, if your person's not a drinker in their 50s and 60s, they're unlikely to develop alcohol problems over time.
Blinded or unblinded, out of curiosity.
So, right, so what would be the issue? What would be the issues there?
Anecdotally, I was just thinking about one of my friends who one time thought he was drunk after drinking a lot of non-alcoholic beer. So I was wondering if they could still blind it because the placebo effect is so strong.
So yeah, it's one of those things that's kind of semi-blinded. So the initial proposal, so it's actually the same author. So Ken Maternal.
Like they would be
They wouldn't be allowed to drive.
or do anything. That's interesting.
So so what they did was people are supposed to have it with dinner, right? So it's supposed to be like their evening meal, supposed to drink it with their evening meal after. So their initial proposal was to randomize it to do red wine and then de-alcoholized red wine, so that it would taste similar. For some reason, the IRB wouldn't allow that. So what they wound up doing is it's essentially grain alcohol, like diluted grain alcohol mixed with Kool-Aid versus just the Kool-Aid. I don't know why that was better, but yeah. So that's what it is. So the participants are, in theory, they are not told what they get when they get these jugs. Don't know if they're, to what extent people actually know what treatment they're on.
It's cool.
Yeah. So it's really, really interesting how they got this study through, because there are many years of studies like this that people were saying, oh well, what about these other factors, and so now they're actually trying to do it in a trial.
How strong is it considered if you take a study like this and you say hypothesize that the effect is related to blood thinning activity of alcohol? How strong is it to add one little piece of data to what you're collecting, like, I don't know, coagulation time or something, and then to make more of a mediator argument about the data that you're gathering, instead of just saying like, there's a correlation, to actually make a statement about possible mediators? Is that bad study design, or is that like strong? Does that significantly improve the argument? Or?
Yeah, right. So any given study is not that strong, right? So I'm an epidemiologist. I believe in observational data. There are people who don't, but I do think it really does tell us. It can tell us about the world if we're careful about what we do and how we hypothesize. So this study, if it was just this study, I would not really believe it, right? But we do have short-term feeding studies that show effects of on coagulation. We know that it affects HDL cholesterol. There are other issues or other sorts of experimental data where we have potential mediators. There have been studies where you can look at those mediators. Mediation can be a little tricky. There's some sort of technical issues that go into it that make it not as straightforward as you kind of want it to be. But yeah, that also helps. So I think when we're trying to talk about causality, we don't want to just look at any study in isolation. We want to pull in as much information from as many different sources as we can.
So with designing these studies, is it good to add those pieces of information, even if you're not planning on writing about it, because it is needed in the literature if we're ever going to make a causal argument?
Well, so yes, to a point, right? So you probably don't want to collect a lot of data that you're really not going to use. How much do you think would add to the study, money and logistics-wise, to try and collect coagulation time?
Oh, it'd be hard.
Yeah. Right. So 38,000 people, across the U.S. That's not an easy thing to do. You might not need all 38,000 if you're looking at coagulation time, right? So you could do a sub-study, and a lot of times that's what happens. You do a sub-study where you've got a smaller proportion. So this study is run out of Harvard, where you could get the people who are in the Boston area who could actually come in and do blood sample, blood draws, and that sort of thing. Other questions? Another study that they did that's kind of cool was that they were looking at So they went to Germany, and they, so there were some areas of Germany where there are wine drinking areas and then beer drinking areas. Okay? So trying to get at the, is it the red wine versus other things. And what they showed was that people who drink the thing that is sort of the standard in their area actually do better, right? So they're the people who are probably drinking socially, moderately, and their MI rates were lower. So, in the wine drinking areas, it looked like the wine was the most protected, and in the beer drinking areas, it was the beer that was most protected. And so what they sort of concluded from that was, there are sort of social aspects that go along with it, but probably the biologic effect is the alcohol, and not the constituents, the other constituents of the alcoholic beverages. So one of the nice things about our cohort study is we have temporal order, right? We know that our exposure happened before our outcome, which is one of the key things that you need in order for something to be a cause, right? The exposure has to precede the outcome. We're looking at incident disease for the most part. We're looking at, people who had not previously had a heart attack and trying to determine the rate of heart attack after that. One of the downsides, right, is that this can take a very long time. And you have to follow up a lot of people, which takes a lot of money, takes a lot of time, takes a lot of people. And so the cohort studies have to be big operations. If you're doing a cohort, your sort of original data collection, prospective follow-up, that's a big operation. So the regard study that's based here is a prospective cohort study, and so they have whole phone bank, people calling. There are people who do medical record retrievals. There are people who do the scanning, the programming of all the data collection forms. So this is a really big investment of time and effort. And in order to sort of have enough cases of whatever outcome you're looking for, you have this issue. You have to have, your pool has to produce enough cases of the outcome of interest. Right? So the less common the disease, the more people and the longer time you need. Make sense? So one of the ways that we try and get around that is with a case control study. Right? So instead of sort of starting with this pool of people at risk, what we do is we identify cases of the disease, and then we identify a control group without the disease. And what the control group is saying is sort of, you're using it to compare the exposure history. So you're saying, are people with the disease more likely than the sample of people without the disease to be exposed? So for my example, a case control study, this is a study of persistent pulmonary hypertension of the newborn, which I know we have a neonatologist here, so I will try not to butcher this, so please correct me if I'm wrong. But my understanding is it's a disorder where where the fetal to sort of external to non-fetal circulation doesn't quite work right. It's my vague understanding of this. Right, so we have cases. Luckily, this is pretty rare because it's a bad condition. And then they recruited 836 infants and mothers without PPHN. And they interviewed these women, the mothers, about exposure to SSRIs during pregnancy. They actually interviewed them about a whole bunch of stuff. Right? So you don't want to, one of the things with the case control studies, you're asking, a lot of times you're looking at your exposure after the outcomes occurred. Right? So these women know whether or not their newborns are essentially in the NICU. So that could change how they report their exposure. So what they did was they actually have a quite extensive interview, and they asked them about all of the drug exposures that they had, both over-the-counter and prescription, during their pregnancy. So the women don't know what the hypothesis is, and actually the interviewers didn't know what the hypothesis was either, to try and keep any subtle sort of biases from creeping into the interviews.
Do you have to put your target farther down the list than you put like dummy questions at the beginning to kind of wear out the maybe like over positive response?
You certainly don't want to put it like as the first thing.
Yeah.
There's a whole art to that, and that's honestly not my my area of expertise. So David Rhodes, who's the operations manager for the regard study, is actually really good at sort of at thinking about how do you sort of set up these questionnaires to get the least biased responses.
What happens if you get like some interesting responses to the dummy questions? I guess it wasn't your hypothesis. Is that your next study then?
Yeah, or you can use that data, right? So a lot of times, you know, particularly as trainees, you're not using the data that was collected for the primary hypothesis, right? You're a lot of times, you know, if you think about a cohort study, right? These cohort studies were started years and years ago, right? And so, you know, you come in as a trainee, or even in case control studies, right? And you're looking at, okay, so I have this question, can I answer my question with the data already available? Yeah. So that happens a lot, right? So you usually want to make those, even with dummy questions, you want to make rigorous enough that they give you useful data. So one of the interesting stories about that is self-rated health. You know, so you ask, you know, how would you rate your health? Excellent, fair, good, poor. That's not an order, very good. But that was actually a dummy question that was added, I think, to the SF-12, just to sort of get people thinking, you know, started with the survey, and it turned out to be the most predictive of mortality. So, you know, that was not one that they actually thought was going to be, you know, useful, but it turned out to be one of the most useful predictors of mortality. So yeah, you want to make your dummy questions as good as you can. Right, and a lot of times they're not, strictly speaking, dummy questions, right? Because you want to get all of the risk factors, the known risk factors for PPHN as well. So again, here's a sort of a similar graph. Now we're looking at odds ratios rather than relative risk, but again, we're going, you know, our lowest possible value is 0, and it could go up as high, you know, the technical upper bound is infinity. So we have 3 exposure groups, right? So never is a reference group, so they're 1. The null value for these ratio measures is always 1. And then we have maternal use of SSRI before week 20 exclusively, or any use after week 20. So thoughts about this one?
Big confidence band.
Yeah, really big confidence bound. But look what the range is for that confidence bound, right? So I'm an epidemiologist, right? So they're looking at their point estimate is like 5. Their confidence bound is going from 2 to 16, right? So you're somewhere between the odds of PPHN for women who use SSRIs after week 20 are likely somewhere between 2 and 16-fold higher. Okay, so that's still pretty substantial, even if it's just 2-fold. So, any thoughts about why before week 20 and after week 20?
I'd say it's physiological reasons, you know, that to do with the fetal circulation, how it matures and how it prepares as it goes through term. The reasons why you could, I mean, I think there's a physiological reason why it could only be something that would matter later in gestation.
Right, so there's this sort of physiologic hypothesis, right? So you have to, you know, this is not, as someone who doesn't do this sort of research, I would never sort of lead a study like this that could contribute, but you have to know about, you know, what is the physiologic hypothesis, and that it's likely because of the physiology of how this condition develops that it's going to be a later in gestation, an issue later in gestation rather than earlier. So given that there's not really an association early and there is one late, does that strengthen your confidence that this might actually be real? Yeah, like maybe, right? So if the confounding, if there was sort of some other issue that was going on, you would expect that maybe this would also be higher, whereas physiologically improbable means maybe there's a problem with how your study was done. This is actually pretty controversial. So there was this was pretty much the first study. There have been several studies since that have not necessarily replicated this finding.
I've got a question about how you interpret those confidence intervals, because to me, I guess I think about sort of the roll of dice and exactly where the point estimate doesn't necessarily matter. In the same way, you can imagine a slightly different variation of this data where that bottom confidence interval crosses 0. And the difference between that and the one on the screen to me would be pretty trivial. So, I mean, when the confidence interval is that wide, can you put that much stock in where the bottom of the confidence interval is?
Okay, so yes, I think you can. So the confidence interval so if you're pulling from a random distribution, right, the confidence interval will contain the true value, the true underlying value from that distribution 95% of the time. Right? So it doesn't matter how wide that is, that's still going to be true. So, you know, it's certainly telling you that you don't have a lot of certainty about where this point estimate is. But it doesn't really change the fact that this is, you know, highly statistically significant association. Meaning, you know, so it, you know, you don't have a lot of certainty. Could be double, could be 16-fold higher, but.
What was the p-value with that? Was it like less than 0.01 or was it closer to 0.05?
Oh, it was teeny. Yeah. I don't remember the exact value, but it was far less than 0.05, which is our sort of conventional p-value, which I guess probably David Redden talked to you about last week.
And if you assume a standard distribution, not that you can, but if you do, and you start to try to widen your confidence interval, then it's gonna like expand tremendously, right? To include, you know, those far standard deviations. I mean, well, I guess what I'm saying is that like to include more than 95%, that bottom band may go like way over 0, just because.
Way over 1, right?
Way over 1, I'm sorry, way over 1, like closer to 0, just because you're starting to get out into a realm that is pragmatically less useful because you have people on extreme ends.
So you're, okay, looking at a blackboard for this, to answer this question. Right, so the width of the confidence interval is related to a couple of different things. Okay, so it's related to how many cases you have, essentially, and it's going to be related to the, you know, where your odds ratio is, so the difference between your exposed and your unexposed group, or in this case, your cases and your controls. And it's going to be related to the variability of your exposure estimates. So in this case, you know, we could widen the, if we said, okay, 95% isn't good enough, we want a 99%, that would certainly get wider. In this case, I think it would still exclude that null bound of 1. But you know, one of the things, particularly when you're thinking about rare conditions, you're sort of insisting on really, really narrow confidence intervals can be a little bit counterproductive, just because this was a major effort to identify the 377 cases of PPHN. You know, because it's just not luckily not something that happens all that common. So, you know, these are pulling from multiple, you know, major medical centers.
There's one other thing I see about with the confidence intervals, I guess, is it's one of the things where you might like to see the actual raw numbers, right? Because if this was the case that there was 6 cases in the 377, but 0 in the other one, you might be kind of, you know, well, there were just only 6. There was only 5%, versus if there was 10% in one group and 50% in the other group, you might feel, you know, differently about it. You'd like to see the raw numbers of SSRI use and the incidence of PPHN, because sometimes it might make more sense than when you see this picture.
Right. So looking at the raw numbers is really helpful, and actually the paper has them. I just made, this is my graph, just for the purposes of projecting it, because that table is, you know, I tried to put it on the slide. It doesn't really reproduce well. So yeah, they do provide the raw numbers, and it is a small number of cases. And you're talking about maybe 12 cases in the exposed group. One of the limitations of a case control study, though, is it doesn't really tell you about incidence, right? So the proportion of participants in the study with PPHN is really high, right? This is not the proportion of babies with PPHN, right? This is a design decision that they said, okay, we could find 377 cases. This is basically all the cases from these, big areas where they're pulling from. And then this number is actually kind of arbitrary, right? So that's a design issue. They just said, okay, we're going to get, this many cases, or this many controls, right? The more controls you have, the more information you get, and that can help to narrow that confidence bound. But it's not. But once you get above, 3 or 4 controls per case, you're not going to narrow that confidence bound very much. So so case control studies are not going to be good for telling you about incidence. They tell you about sort of relative distribution exposures. Other questions or comments? Okay, so these are efficient when the outcome is rare. Right? So if you were to enroll pregnant women and then try and do this study prospectively, you would need a tremendous study population, right? Hundreds of thousands of women potentially. And that's, just not really feasible. But in this case, we're asking about exposure after the outcome has already occurred, right? So that can change how people report. Or, in this case, it's reported exposure. It can also change exposure, like the lupus example. So just briefly talk about correlation and causation. So you'll often hear correlation does not equal causation. People say this all the time. So why not? Why can't we just sort of say, okay, we saw this association, therefore this thing causes that thing?
The rooster and the sun.
Sorry?
Like the rooster's crow is correlated with the rising of the sun, but they're unrelated. I mean, just philosophical point.
Yeah, so philosophical point, right. And there's some sort of, there's a second factor, or there's another factor that's associated with both of those things, right? So we've got biases, right? So we've got things that are sort of, causing spurious correlations. And, we think about a bunch of different biases. Confounding, measurement error, selection bias, and others. As epidemiologists, we tend to worry about all of them, but confounding in particular is something that we spend a lot of time worrying about. So confounding happens when the people who are exposed are different than the people who aren't in ways that are separate from that exposure, right? The other way of saying that is that the risk is different. The underlying risk is different in the exposed and unexposed groups. So we'll often use sort of diagrams that look like this. So if we're interested in whether race ethnicity is a causal risk factor for obesity, probably it's not. One of the things we look at when we're talking about the population distributions is the age distribution varies across race ethnicities in the U.S. It's just sort of a demographic fact, and age is related to obesity. Right? So some proportion of the association between race, ethnicity, and obesity is actually due to the differences in the age distribution, right? So this is a sort of classic confounding setup. With age, right, we actually have a lot of statistical tools we can control for it in a bunch of different ways, and we can, to the best of our models, we can remove that confounding. if we're looking at fruit intake and obesity, right, so we have this sort of propensity to be healthy. People who, tend to be healthy are more likely to eat a lot of fruit, and they're less likely to be obese, right? So some part of that correlation between fruit intake and obesity is likely to be this sort of healthiness. So how do we measure healthiness? Right? It's a lot more nebulous than measuring age. Age we do a pretty good job at measuring. Here, you could do some questionnaires. You can do things like look at physical activity, which is probably also somewhere in this pathway. You can look at, are people getting their annual flu shots? There's things you can look at, but it's not something we can really get our arms around very well, right? And so we have this confounding by something that is sort of nebulous. And there we have a much harder time dealing with that kind of confounding in an observational study. One thing that's not confounding, right, so if we want to know about obesity as a risk factor for MI, is diabetes a confounder here? No, right? So diabetes is in this causal pathway, right? So the obesity is a risk factor for diabetes, and the diabetes causes MI. So you need to, so this is not a confounder. You'll sometimes hear people say, oh, adjusting for the thing changes your estimate by more than 10 or 15%. It's a confounder. This is going to change your estimate, right, if you control for diabetes. And what you're doing is you're essentially pulling out that part of the association between obesity and myocardial infarction. If you're doing it as a mediation analysis, then that's actually what you want to be doing. But if you're trying to control for confounding, you need to sort of think about where things are in the causal pathway in order to decide whether something's a confounder or not. So next topic is developing a testable hypothesis. So my postdoc, I was working on the effects of diet on heart failure, which is not a paper, it's not a postdoc, it's like, a whole career. Because to develop a hypothesis that you can actually get your arms around, you need to be a lot more specific, right? So what aspects of diet? We're talking about specific foods, nutrients, diet patterns, deficiencies, overloads, affects how, right? Are we talking about preventing, slowing progression, preventing mortality, reducing symptoms? And then in who, right? So we need to specify our population. So there are two frameworks that can be helpful for thinking about designing a good research question. So one is the FINER criteria for the idea, and then the framing for what's called the PICO approach, and both of these are acronyms. So FINER is feasible, interesting, novel, ethical, and relevant. I think these are all kind of subjective, but you certainly don't want to do a study that you don't think is interesting, right? Feasibility is going to be relative, right? So what's feasible for a student is different than what's feasible for a faculty member versus, a junior faculty member versus a senior faculty member. These are relative. We want to add new information, but no one's ever entirely novel. Everyone's sort of building on previous studies. PICO is the patient population of interest, the intervention or issue. I think this should actually be exposure, but it doesn't, you don't get the nice acronym. Comparison, so who are you comparing? Outcome and time frame. Questions about these? Right, so here's a better question, right? A better research question. Is intake of fatty fish associated with hospitalization for or death from heart failure among women? Right, so now we have a more specific exposure, a more specific outcome, and some sort of population description, but still not quite enough, right? But it's hard to get all of these components in a single sentence. So here for fatty fish, it's salmon, herring, and mackerel. We have 9 years of follow-up for our outcomes of interest. Our women are 48 to 83 at baseline. 2 counties in central Sweden, and we're starting with people who don't have heart failure and looking at their first heart failure. Okay, so this is something you can actually kind of write a paper on. Questions? Here are results, again, sort of a relative risk graph. What you can see is that compared to people who never eat fatty fish, you get some decrease and then possibly a balance up at the end. One of the things about studying these 2 counties in central Sweden is the population is really homogeneous. So most, like 75% of the population is eating one of these once or twice a week. So we don't have much data, never, and the people who are 3 or more times a week, a lot of them are eating pickled herring, which is a huge salt load, and also drinking heavily. So that's sort of a drinking thing, and we weren't fully able to tease that out. Questions? All right, so, again, in and of itself, the study is suggestive. It doesn't really prove anything. There have been trials in other of the marine fatty acids, which are the sort of postulated pharmacologic agent that might explain this, and they're kind of equivocal. So maybe, probably doesn't hurt. So we're running a little low on time. So, if you think about, once you have your idea, if you were to come to me, as part of like the bird consult, think about, okay, what's your outcome? What's your exposure? What is your comparison, right? So are you comparing high versus low? Are you comparing exposed versus not exposed? Are you looking at some sort of dose response? Who are you studying? And how long, what is your follow-up time? And then what are the important confounders, right? So the important confounders are things that are going to be strongly associated with outcome and exposure. So these are things often demographics, comorbidities, health behaviors. That is really a subject matter question, right? So you have to know you have to do some reading and think about, what are the physiologic risk factors? What sort of the demographic patterns? How are that's not something that is sort of a cut and paste. You have to think it through. And then what kind of study design are you going to do? How frequent is the outcome? Right. So if it's something that happens pretty frequently, a cohort study would probably work. If it's very rare, you're probably going to need a case control study. Can you measure the exposure after the outcome and get it and have a valid estimate? Does the prevalence tell you about incidence of your outcome? And then how much time and money do you have to actually do this study? Is this something you can do, that you can invest a lot in, or is this sort of you're at the early hypothesis generating stage where you're thinking maybe an ecologic or cross-sectional study? So this has been I think a very broad overview. There are a lot of resources out there that will help. These are 2 textbooks that I like. So the Epidemiology Introduction is, I think rigorous but also really easy to read, which makes it nice. The other one I have up here is free online, which is also good. So this is Principles of Epidemiology and Public Health Practice, and this is online, published by the CDC. For more resources on Finer and PICO, there's this paper from Canadian Journal of Anesthesiology. They didn't lay out, they're not the developers, but they do a really nice job of sort of walking through how to think about designing a research question. In terms of reporting, so some of the people may be familiar with the Consort guidelines that are used for clinical trials. For epidemiology, it's a little less rigid, but we have the stroke guidelines. And so there's the checklist, and then there's an extensive explanation. This is on reporting, but it's really very helpful to think about actually at the beginning, so you can think about what do you need to tell people to make sure that that information is set up from the start. And then finally, the CCTS. We have drop-in clinics, seminars, webinars, and then also one-on-one consultations. And this is most useful if you start early. So, you know, if people come to me and say, I have this data, what's my study design? Sometimes I can help them, but it's really better if you start thinking about the design and the analysis when you're designing your study. So, you know, I would say start early if you can. So you're welcome to contact me or any of the other statisticians and epidemiologists, or, you know, there are a number of people who are very good at UAB outside and other places outside of that particular resource. Any questions, comments? Oh, it looks like we have a, okay, just a thank you. Yeah, so your resources are available. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I want to get this part of the one. Seven. Later.
Thanks very much.
Can I ask you a quick question? So where would, like, describing, I guess it's sort of a cohort study, but I don't know if it is, describing populations that you're, so like, you're just testing a population, like kind of universal testing on a population, and you're gathering that data. And then sort of just descriptive statistics on that population. I mean, is that considered a cohort study? Or what, I mean, in your cohort is just everybody who came through whatever your screening process was?
Right, so actually, because I said it's hard to narrow this down, so I took out my slides on surveillance. So that's sort of a surveillance question. Like, what is the prevalence of disease in my population? So like the screening kind of population. And you could, it could be cross-sectional, or it could be sort of a cohort, depending on sort of how you set up your study. So if you're just sort of taking all comers, that's pretty much just a surveillance cross-sectional.
Right.
You could say, you know, if you're doing an outbreak investigation, then you're sort of saying, okay, these people didn't have one of these.
Right, and there's some time point at which you're kind of marking, like, damage.
Yeah.
But then you'd have to have data prior to that time point, otherwise you couldn't say much about it. Okay. But so there is a category of epidemiologic study that's considered surveillance. That's just
sort of the sort of how many.
Yeah.
And then what I really focused on was more of the studies that try and get why.
Yeah. So what in terms of when you're gathering data on, when you're doing surveillance data, or at least your study design is largely surveillance in nature. How do you, what data is important to report on to sort of assist with that next step if you ever get to that point where you're really trying to figure out, you know?
So it depends on the topic area. So do you have a disease in mind?
So we're testing, like, we're just surveilling, like, everybody in CPM for hepatitis C. we've
Yeah,
got
sorry.
a Center for Psychiatric Medicine. So they're testing everybody when they come to an ED or in the Center for Psychiatric Medicine across all the different units is being tested for hepatitis C, and then we're going to describe the population. I mean, generally speaking, that just in a more kind of granular, at a more granular level. It's not going to say much about mediators or anything, or any kind of causal relationships, but we certainly are going to make some correlations. I guess the question is, what, for epidemiologists, what's important to know about that population?
Okay, so, right. So, there's not like a bright line between, doing sort of a study for surveillance versus sort of a cross-sectional study.
Yeah.
So now you're starting to compare prevalence between, men and women,
right.
Age groups,
right.
all of
all
those
those
sorts of things.
Yeah.
So, the things that you think are, I mean, from your knowledge of the disease state and your study population, the things that you think are interesting are the ones that I would certainly report.
Yeah.
And from if I was reading this and thinking from an epidemiologic point of view, how representative is this, right? So I'd want to know things like, did you get everybody?
Mm-hmm.
Did people have to consent, or was this sort of standard of care?
Mm-hmm.
Did the IRB, if you didn't have them consent, did the IRB say this is okay? And then questions about how people wound up in your study population.
Mm-hmm.
So what was the catchment area?
Okay.
Were people being sent from the ED to other places?
Right.
Or are they, what percentage are coming from the ED versus sort of direct admit?
No, so that's interesting. So reporting on who the population is that's reporting and giving some kind of data about who the population is that's reporting to this place, not just what population reported to the place, but who's even the possible population that could report to this place.
Yeah.
That could end up in our UAB Center for Psychiatric Medicine. What's that population?
Right.
Because it is, it's from all over the state it's from. So finding that data, making sure to include that.
Yeah, that's sort of generally a tricky, a lot of research gets done this way, from academic referral medical centers, because that's where the researchers are.
Right.
But it's a tricky thing, right, because, and I don't know about your particular situation, but you can get, people, less severe cases that are local and more severe cases that are coming from far away.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's true. But then also, you have, for psychiatry, specifically, I'm working through emergency department, but for psychiatry specifically, they have bed problems. So it's all psychiatric hospitals are kind of one catchment area to a certain extent.
Okay.
But just kind of reporting on that data, that I don't know if that's something, I know we have the data, but I don't know if it's something that we had intended on including or not. But
yes, probably if you can get the close-in, what percentage are coming in from close-in counties versus faraway counties.
Yeah, and then just looking at the characteristics of, if it's a small enough number, I guess, just looking at the characteristics of the people who are not coming from close and seeing if they're different, significantly different from the people who are close. Mm-hmm. And just reporting that information so that people can decide what to do with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hey,
how's it going?
are you going to Academy Health?
Mm-mm.
You ever heard of them?
I haven't yet. I was thinking about going this year, and then things got complicated.
Yeah, I've never been to this. This was my first time.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, I've heard it's. I went to the nursing before, but I didn't stay for.
What does nurses stand for?
National Research Service Award. So that's the 232.
That's your art.
Yeah. So I was on the first version of the K-12, and so I went as part of that.
So that's right before Academy Health, Patient State for Academy Health.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really expensive. It's $1,500 or something like that. So. Yeah. So are there conferences you usually go to?
During fellowship, the one I went to every year was SGIM, Society of General Internal Medicine. I mean, it's not the most specific conference. It's like a sort of a big networking, people who are generalists, but, you know, kind of have a good group even if they're doing capacity different research. But and then this year I went to SMDM, Society of Medical Decision Making.
Okay.
But I mean, I'm looking for sort of a, eventually when I get more disease specific, then I'll probably consider a more disease specific conference.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I heard that we have to really good in terms of the methods. So it's really strong, and you know, if the disease states are really broad.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not doing any like pre-courses or anything like that, but hopefully I'll get some hints about some new methods or something.
Nice. Where is it this year?
It's in New Orleans.
Oh, okay. Pretty easy to get to.
Yeah, I'm going to drive. I guess there's no direct flights from Birmingham to New Orleans.
There used
There
to
used
be,
to
and
be,
they
it's right
canceled it. Yeah.
I'm keeping my fingers crossed for a direct between here and RDU. All my family lives there. It seems like that would be sort of logical.
Where are you?
Raleigh, Durham.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah.
But yeah, New Orleans, I'm just surprised there's not direct from Birmingham to New Orleans.
Yeah, I don't know why it was Southwest. I don't know why they stopped running it.
So that'd be like an hour flight, but it's a 5-hour drive. It's kind of annoying. And if you do a layover, you might as well drive it.
I took the train last year, which on the way there was great. On the way back, we got stuck behind such a great train. We're going like 20 miles an hour through.
The trains are less reliable in the southeast than they are sort of in the northeast, where they're relied on more.
Yeah, that's in the tracks in the Northeast too, so, I don't know. I mean, they're definitely less frequent, because there's only one train a day in the morning.
Yeah. But if they cancel the train between DC and New York, like that screws a lot of people over, and
Right.
people who like were relying on it versus like the train between Birmingham and New York got canceled. It's not going to kill the business because I know that people are doing it all the time.
So how, things are going okay, or?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Been here a year now, so I waiting on the K-12. So I only did internal applications this year, and then if I get that, then I'll focus on doing that research, and if not, then I'll focus on the external application for the fall.
Okay. So preventive medicine is good with you guys getting Ks?
They definitely want to see it, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we're not one of the K-gap people. Is that what you meant? Like cardiologists don't like Ks because they make so much money here.
Yeah, that, and then also, I mean, the indirects are really low on Ks.
Yeah.
So, now I'm a department chair, I think so they do that. So a bunch of our actually junior faculty have been really successful, which is fantastic with the Ks, but then, you know, that brings in less money than I think that. But I think, you know, for people who, that's not, I'm certainly not discouraging people.
I mean, is it, what's the alternative pathway? Is the alternative pathway to spend more time sort of as a team scientist before you become independent and just working on R01s as a team scientist, or is the alternative to just become independent more quickly and skip the K?
So the NIH is kind of pushing the idea that people can become independent more quickly and skip the K. Yeah, I mean, that's the real question, right? So like, the dean's office is like, why aren't you people bringing in more indirects? And like, oh, you know, this is actually great. You know, they've got these K words, but
Hey man, K word is going to be a great marker for future
absolutely,
indirects.
absolutely, yeah. So I'm like, okay, we gotta invest in, you know, our junior faculty.
Yeah, no, everybody's been supportive of trying for Ks. So I guess the issue then is if I don't get Ks, then what do I do with myself?
I mean, right, and you know, I had a K-12 so short, and as a PhD trained person, you know, it's hard to sort of argue that you do like PhD and then a postdoc and then a K-12, and like saying work trained. Because a lot of the K-12, the clinically trained K-12 scholars from the UAB have gone on to get extra points, and I think that happens work well. It's not as straightforward.
And you didn't do an external K after that, you just did internal.
Yeah, I would have had it would have been a tough sell.
How do you sort of characterize your work, like there's a breakdown between independent, like tenure stuff versus like team science?
So mostly team science. I mean, so I partially because I like it. You know, I like being on CCTS and I like being I'm also in the CFAR core, methods core. And partially because my ARs are the ones that I really hit. So I've had some industry-funded contracts that I was the PI of.
Yeah.
Um,
But I can imagine that it's like less stability in being independent than being a methodologist who's in team science. It just seems like the stability of being a smaller part of lots of grants. Because, I mean, the horror stories I hear is like you get your first R1, and then it's like, well, where's your second R1? Because your first R1 comes like a third of your time, and so it just seems like a never-ending cycle of trying to keep 2 R1s. You're actually going to be like this independent shop.
Right, and I think that's honestly pretty rare for any sort of health services, epidemiology kind of research that, even the people with like the most sort of R1 funding in my department, most of them have 1, maybe 2, and then are working on other projects as well as kind of collaborator. And I think that's actually more realistic, right? Because for this kind of stuff, it's not anybody has like a lab with a bunch of postdocs and graduate students, so the way we can function. So yeah, I mean it's a balance. The downside of being on a bunch of different projects is you're pulled in a bunch of different directions, and then what happens when things hit. So we're like messing around with effort to try and get my effort to like 115% funded because several grants that I've been collaborating with.
Are you worried about the losing Andrea stuff?
I mean,
she's very optimistic, but I can't tell how much to read between the lines that they're even talking about what's going to happen at the agency.
Oh, I mean, this grant has been like one of the least predictable projects I've been involved in. Just because, Alabama, announced this, and they're like, oh, this is so cool. Alabama's actually going to be like on the forefront of something. Like, let's write this grant. So, Andrea can like. So I was involved right at the beginning, and then it was like, all this political stuff started happening. So the governor was being impeached, and like, and that just kept pushing things on. And so like, we're looking in the newspaper, and it's like, what's going on? We're going to these meetings to do that, and they're like, we don't know what's going on. And so it's been a mess. I guess, I don't think if the grant gets pulled, it's certainly not going to ruin Andrew's career.
Yeah.
It won't ruin mine.
How in politics does that work? I mean, if the grant gets pulled, that doesn't like give you a black mark in the NIH. I mean, it's just sort of that one program officer might be like a second thought the next time you bring a similar mechanism to the table, or is it?
Maybe. I mean, I feel like this one is so far outside of our control that it's not like we've mismanaged anything. Like, I think we're doing the best we can. And, I think my impression, I haven't talked to the program officer, but talking to Andrea about the conversation with the program officer, they recognize that, we don't have control over what management does.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Hopefully that's fine.
Yeah. I mean, I've honestly never been in a situation like this, like, where the things that are so far outside of our control are just like happening and just keep rolling. There's always a disaster, but it's a sort of one disaster after
And you say you're the chair now?
Mm-hmm.
Is that something new?
Yeah, about 6 weeks.
How's that going?
It's good. I'm not applying for the position, but it's not something I want to do long term. And I don't know. The job is structurally very strange. So, so I have to cut my research fund like percentages to 85%, so I'm technically 15% from chair. But I'm also teaching 2 classes this summer, and so yeah, and then like it's everything from budgets and training your faculty and performance reviews to an undergrad student who was listed on a paper, like as a middle author on a paper, and contacted the journal demanding to be first author. Because the faculty members in my department, it turns out this is my responsibility to mediate. So it's been interesting.
How long will it take to do the search for a new person?
Well, so I'm the second interim chair. The first interim chair served for 18 months. When I took this role on, we had one candidate who interviewed twice and one who was coming for a first interview. Now we have 0 candidates.
Was this McGuinn or Gwen?
McGuinn was the interim person.
Who was the chair before?
Donna Arnett. So she would have left before you came. And she is very, very. And,
Who's Dr. Mutter?
so he is, so Paul Muttner, he's the vice chair of the department.
He's epidemiology.
He's epidemiology, yeah.
And there's no candidates right now.
So, right, so we have identified 2 people who've been asked to apply, and if both of them say no, and I think either would be very good. If both of them decline to apply, we'll start with the search. But it means reconstituting a committee, because Paul Muttner has been the chair of the committee. It's a break. And yeah, that'll take 3 months to get candidates, and then yeah, we can get midwinter probably.
So good luck.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't regret doing it. It's just a lot of interpersonal stuff, which
is it pretty traditional in your field that that's the goal? Everybody wants to eventually be that?
no.
I understand that's not necessarily the case in like some of the social science departments. Actually being the chair is a headache and nobody wants to do it.
Right. So some departments will, it rotates.
Yeah.
But generally not. The research departments usually someone's hired to be chair. The places where it rotates, usually people are right. There are actually a ton of open FP chair positions around the country because very few people want this job. I think that there was sort of a generation of people who really wanted it, but they've all moved up to deans, which has left a big gap. So like Donna left to be dean at Kentucky. There's several other. So like Columbia's been their chair's been open for 2 years. UNC is looking, and apparently they're having a hard time finding good candidates.
Wow.
So yeah, it's interesting.
Is it just a money thing? Like, do they just need to pay the chair more?
No, I think it's more that people get into it because they want to do research, and it's really hard to keep that up while being chair. And that there is just such a the range of responsibilities is so big, and some of it is important and strategic, and thinking about.
But aren't those things true of like the chair of the Department of Medicine or something too, where it's like these are all former successful researchers, and this job just prevents them from being able to continue on as a solo researcher, and lots of headaches go along with that job.
Probably. I mean, I think there are people who are. I think there's probably more positions for I'm going to be in charge than epidemiologists.
It's a personality type thing.
It might be maybe not. I mean, that's usually broadly generalized. Yeah, and I'm also guessing that because medicine departments are so much bigger, that there's a lot more delegation, right? So I had to preserve this time off of us. I don't know why I'm approving people's vacation requests and so for all of the faculty and then 10 staff members. All these things. So I'm guessing some of the makers just do not go into the US system and personally approve all of these things.
Right.
Yeah. And also, you know, they've got the division directors who are doing most of the, like, you know, mediation. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's interesting. I certainly have learned a lot of this. Yeah, nobody wants to. Is that something you want to do?
I mean, I don't think so. I mean, I guess there's always an attraction to sort of like the, you know, the administrative side of the, you know, politics is always interested in me, and so you could view it as like a bigger picture type thing where you're influencing, you know, others who are doing your research, and so it's not completely outside of the realm of, but again, you know, the headaches that go along with it, I can't imagine.
I mean, and that's exactly the practice the most fun. I like sort of sitting, you know, with one of the assistant professors in my department and being like, okay, like, where do you go next? Like, which things do you say no to? Like, you know, that part is definitely rewarding. There's a lot of other stuff too. And I think because we've been without each other for so long, like, we were just a little chaotic and uncertain.
Yeah. I mean, I could see where it would be interesting to like have a center or something where you like have a little piece that you're like in control over. But
That sounds better.
being a division chair or a department chair seems like, I mean, the pay is significantly higher. I think that's, and just the being in charge part probably does attract type of personalities. But you're exactly right. Like, that job, that's nothing like, you know, a couple hour ones. So if that's what you want to do, then that's probably not good enough.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, I don't know. Well, I mean, I know what Donna got me, but like taking on being interim chair, I got a 15% raise, which I mean is certainly not nothing. It's fine, and like it'll go away when I'm not chairing anymore. But it's not like huge amounts of money.
Yeah.
At least in that department, probably medicine, interim medicine.
Yeah, and there's probably a bigger differential too for somebody like me who's a general internist. You know, if you were a cardiologist, the difference between that cardiologist and the chair would probably be lower than the difference between a cognitive specialist and the chair.
Anyway,
All right.
kind of interesting.
Well, thanks for the talk, Andrew.
Yeah. Yeah. Enjoy Academy Health.
I will. I think it's supposed to rain the whole time.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going up to Mento and it's supposed to rain all weekend.
You going where?
Mento? So
Mento?
it's a town, like a little sort of resort-y kind of town. In Alabama. So like about halfway from Chattanooga. There's a couple of, there's a state park and then it's right on the Georgia line, there's Georgia State Park. It's really pretty. Maybe it was still hiking.
I'll go where it works out for you.
Yeah, me too. Take care.
See ya.